Well, hey everybody, I've got Jason Eliason with me here. Jason's a friend of mine, but more importantly, he's one of our church planters in the BC and Yukon district. And we thought we'd take a little bit, I thought we'd take a little bit of time to chat about the church planting journey that Jason and Kelsey have been on. And Jason, we'd love to sort of connect with you in terms of that sense of calling and then what you've learned in the last 2 years. But before we do that, for those who don't know you, have never met you, sort of give us the brief bio, if you will.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me, Len. My name is Jason, and I'm married to Kelsey. And next week is our 13th wedding anniversary. And we
Nice.
have 3 boys and a dog. So our oldest is almost 8, our middle is 6, our youngest is 3. And they keep us super busy, especially being home all the time
Yeah.
over the last several months. And yeah, we planted our church in September of 2016, and I've got lots of hobbies outside of ministry life as well. I love the outdoors, and anything that gets me outside, I'm down. I want to do so.
Right on. Right on. I was thinking, as you say this, we should maybe be doing a parenting interview.
I would
Instead
I
of,
would maybe listen to a parenting interview of somebody else giving advice. I don't know if I would give advice.
yeah, sure, sure. Hey, so before we get into the church planting story, I'd love to back up a little bit and talk about when you had that sense of um, I don't know, call or inclination that maybe church planting was in your future. So tell us about how um, that really began to emerge in your heart.
Yeah, I mean, I always tell our story by starting that it was a bad idea that grew into a conviction over a
Okay.
long period of time. So it wasn't like one moment. It was a really slow process that when we were really young in ministry, we were at a church on Vancouver Island that we grew up in, and it kind of had this pioneering spirit with our leadership, and we were experimenting with campuses when church like multi-site was kind of a new thing, and we took over one campus and then we planted another one in this tiny little community. And what we saw with planting a church is like the influence that we could have in a community, where I would go up and do a youth event, and I had a third of the high school students in the whole town in our church,
Wow.
because there was nothing else to do in this tiny little town. And so
Yeah.
I think that started it, like that thing in my heart. But it was also sort of the emergence of like social media becoming really big. And what I found is like I kept seeing like cool people plant churches, and that's the bad idea. Is like you should never plant a church because someone cool is doing it.
Right.
But I just found, like, for both Kelsey and I, we were just drawn or really interested in people who were pioneering new things, and didn't really know why. Like, it wasn't on our radar, but that idea was, I think, the seed that God used over probably 10 years to really grow a conviction in our heart about this thing. We just couldn't shake it. We were always drawn towards church planters. We wanted to follow stories. We loved hearing the stories of pioneering new things. And then it came a point where we started to pay more attention to that thing in our heart, those ideas. And I started reading more about it. And I think it was Tim Keller's stuff, where he kind of breaks down the research about like one of the best strategies we have of reaching people who are far from God is by planting churches.
Right.
And then he goes on to particularly talk about planting churches in cities, because the world is moving to cities faster than the
Right.
church is moving to cities. And
So
that's where that
So
was
if I
like
can
the
interrupt
switch.
for one sec, Jay. That's just so if people are watching this and they're wondering what that resource is that Keller's book, Center Church?
I think he talks a lot about it but in there, but if you just Google Tim Keller church planting, you'll start to find all of the
Okay.
research and writing that he's done on it. And so that's where, like, I think something switched in our hearts and minds, where we said, oh, that's why we are drawn towards church planting. It's not just about starting something new. It's that taking that risk to start something new has the potential to reach people who are far from God, which is what we're passionate about. We're passionate about the local church and seeing lives change. Like, that was our
Right.
whole thing. And so that really started to grow into a conviction. And thankfully, I was part of local churches that didn't they watered that desire. They
Mm.
fostered that desire in me. They never got weird about it or tried to squash it or send me on my way to just figure it out on my own because they were insecure about it. And so
Mm.
we were able to take our time and let that grow in our hearts over time. So
Right, right.
yeah,
So I think that's such an important point, because uh, I know of some church planters who, they've had that in their heart, but the local church that they're serving in gets like all weird about it, and how many people are you going to take, or how much money are you going to take with you? And so they kind of, well, the nice way of saying it is they release you,
yes,
before you get any traction towards that. And so, what a blessing. So when I entered your story, it was just a couple of years ago, and at that time you were at CLA
yeah,
in Langley. And I don't know a lot about what you're doing there, but when I think, pastoral staff on CLA, I'm thinking, secure paycheck, great team, awesome church. It's kind of like, I don't know, you won the lottery or something when it comes to
yeah.
pastoral ministry. So can you talk a little bit about what it was like to get out of what was probably a relatively comfort, and that doesn't mean it wasn't challenging,
Yeah.
but a relatively comfortable sort of ministry assignment, and then moving into all of the all of the changes and all of the uncertainty of church planting.
Yeah, you're right. It was an awesome place to be. I mean, we had our seasons that was more challenging, but I always say I left at the worst time. It was like the church was getting healthy. The team that I got to work with was amazing. It was just like an awesome place to be. And yeah, so it was sort of weird. At one point, I'm like, am I doing the right thing? Like, this is, you're right about all security, all of those things. And, there's always this, it's this weird thing I find in my personality where like I'm drawn to risk and pioneering, but at the same time, I feel totally risk adverse at this,
Mhm.
like, so I feel like this weird tension where I'm like, this doesn't make any sense, but I'm still drawn to go. But I think one of the things that enabled me as like, even in my personality, of sort of finding myself somewhere between the place of wanting to risk and not wanting to risk,
Mhm.
is that CLA became like not just a verbal supporter, but they were like behind us 100%. So they didn't just talk about support, like they put money where their mouth was. They put
Right.
prayer, they sent people. And so all of a sudden I felt like, oh, I've got some traction here. Like I've got
Mhm.
that. And so I mean, I did lots of different things at CLA, mostly working with youth and young adults, but towards the end, I kind of had this mixed portfolio. But CLA allowed me to, in that year before we launched, they kept paying me full time, but allowed me to have a decreasing portfolio so I could put more of my time towards church planting. So I had that security in that year before we started of a paycheck, but the support and all of everything that came with it. So, I mean, we can't tell our story of Citizens Church without, you know, CLA being, it's just woven into it. Like
Mhm.
they were
Mhm.
like not just a small part, they were a massive part in our story, and still are up to this point.
Right. And in my role as being a catalyst for church planting, I would say uh, that's the best case scenario for church planting, is to have a church. And it doesn't have to be a huge church,
Oh,
but not a huge church like CLA, but to have a church behind you, um, that you've got that encouragement. Hopefully, you've got a bit of finances. They're kingdom minded to release some people, and at the probably the most important thing is you've got this sort of prayer support that positively ushers you out of the building, as it were, and into the new scenario. So
yeah.
tell us a little bit about Citizens Church, where you gather, what it's like. Now, again, for those who are watching, we're in the middle of COVID-19 season, so everything's turned
We
upside down.
gather online.
Yeah. So when before COVID-19 hits, and when we sort of get back to some semblance of normal, like what is Citizens Church like? Where do you gather? What are the things that are important to you?
Yeah. So yeah, we before this we gathered at a high school called Kwantlen Park Secondary, which is kind of right in the heart or right near the heart of the changing, growing city center of Surrey in the Wally neighborhood. So it's a amazing location for us. We have this a 200 seat theater and a big cafeteria area that we do all of our things in. And I would say like the heart of our church early on is what I think defines us is like what we love is like I mean, for lack of better terms, like we love the table and the temple. Like those two, I think we feel like we built our church around kitchen tables, around dining room tables. And that's like our
Right.
favorite thing to do is we call it church around a table, or we stole that phrase from somebody.
Mm-hmm.
And we love community built around a meal together. And that's probably the thing that we're missing the most right now in the season.
Right.
We're still connected. We do Zoom community groups, we do all these things, but just being able to share meals together is something that we really miss. And then we also love the gathering and what happens in the gathering. And so early on, I think that would probably be one of the more defining features. We're a really young church by and large. So we're always looking for, how do we have like older missionaries, we call them, to our church that'll come and like sort of seed that age group. Because I mean,
What do you define as older?
honestly, we used to, now it's like over 30 we call
Oh,
old in our church. We're like, if you're over 30, you're considered old. We just have all these 20 somethings, which is amazing. And the people who are out of that 20 somethings age are unbelievable in our church. And they just, they carry so much heart and passion for the church and for people and for the community that we are trying to become a part of here in Surrey.
right. Yeah, and I feel like I have a special connection with your church because my youngest daughter and son-in-law have been sort of part of things from day one,
Yeah.
early on, anyways, and so it's been cool to watch. And whenever I talk about Citizens Church, I tell about the Sunday of your launch when Leanne and I drove up, and just the strategic location that you're in, because here we kind of drove through this area that was clearly all being sort of renewed and gentrified in Surrey Central there. And then about a block away, from the church, there were about 3 cop cars on a Sunday morning at 9 o'clock that had converged on something in the intersection a block away.
Yeah.
And so you're kind of right on this edge of renewal and gentrification, and what some people think about when they think of, Wally in Surrey.
Yeah. And that was really important to us because we honestly, I think the thing that like got me most excited early on about this neighborhood was all the new things, all like the gentrification side.
Yeah.
But once we moved like into this area and we start to hear the people, you see that there is an ugly side to that, or a painful side to it. And so there's tension everywhere in our neighborhood. And so shortly after we moved, like even before we launched, God really started changing my heart in the way that I viewed this community. And really our approach has been to say, hey, we don't want to be like for something that we shouldn't be or anti things. How can we become a people here in the community that live in the midst of the tension? Like
wow, that's great.
So we've got tons of new immigrants. We've got like the wealth disparity in our neighborhood is vast. We've got racial tensions. We've got all kinds of things happening. And there's the beautiful side of that too. It's just like there's all kinds of people. How do we live in the midst of that and say Jesus is the answer for everything, for everyone, no matter where you find yourself? Jesus is the answer. So we're not trying to lean on one or the other. But you're right. In our physical space, we always say when you walk out of the space that we meet, if you look to our left, it's Wally, it's government assisted housing, that's where we see cop cars a lot. There's, we have like I'm always looking for needles on the ground before we start our service. If you look to your right, it's these beautiful, stunning new condos that are 30 and 40 stories high and all these brand new things. And so they're converging right in front of us. And that was our heart. It's like, we want to live in the middle of all of those things.
Wow.
Because our heart would be, how do we build a diverse church of ethnicities and socioeconomic statuses and ages and experiences? That's easy to say, harder to do, but we're like committed to trying to figure that out as we move ahead.
Wow. So cool. So, hey, I want to land the plane with this conversation. And so let me ask one last question. And it's a bit of a broad question, but So in the 2 years that you have been actively leading this church, you, again, as you said, you launched in September of 2018. Um, what are some of the key things that you have learned about church planting over the last 2 years?
Yeah. I'm convinced again of the importance of church planting and like a pioneering spirit. So I don't even want to limit it to church planting, because I think you can have that multiplication heart or that pioneering spirit where even in long established churches, but
Right.
to say we got to do new things to reach people. And so I'm convinced of that. I think the thing I've learned the most is that, I mean, church planting for me or being a lead pastor has really highlighted areas that I'm gifted in. Like you see that in the life of your church, but also really highlights the areas I'm weak and the areas I'm not good and the areas
Right.
that either I shouldn't try to do anymore because I'm not good at it, or areas that just require a lot of growth. So
Mhm.
it's very exposing personally. There's nowhere to hide anymore. And I think anyone that's been a lead pastor anywhere, like I've heard these things said before from lead pastors, I've really felt that. And I don't know if there is, but it feels like maybe there's an added pressure when you're like, hey, we're trying to get a church sustainable. Like we're trying to get this out of the church plant, you know, phase where we're like, are we going to make it to something that we hope will outlast all of us?
Right.
Um, and then all of it, you're kind of exposed with your weaknesses and all of those, your deficiencies as a leader, because you see
Mhm.
those along with all the good as a leader. And I think that, I mean, it keeps me humble, that's for sure,
Mhm.
reliant on Jesus to build his church, and trying to build a good team around me. And thankfully we've had amazing people with us on this journey from the
Right.
beginning. So,
Right. Great. So I said that was going to be my last question, but I do have one more. So if you were sitting across the table from somebody who is mulling over the idea of church planting, maybe God's placed something in their heart to do that, what would you tell them?
I just say to like keep exploring that thing. Keep talking to church planters, keep reading about church planting, go to church planting environments, and just let God like keep pouring water on that seed.
Mhm.
And I'd say like make sure you feel like you got to feel called to it. So don't just do it like where I started it was I should never plant it if I didn't move out of that first phase of like, oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
It's hard. Like it requires a lot of you, and there's days where you're like, there's a lot of days I'm thinking, did I make the right decision? Am I going to crash and burn like this whole thing? Like this is tough.
Hmm.
But if God calls you to it, you have to do it. So figure it out. And then I would either say like get around church planters.
Yeah.
And if you have an opportunity, this is something that I didn't have. And I mean, I wouldn't change our story, but to have maybe had the opportunity to spend time in a church planting environment, serving and seeing it,
Mhm.
I think that would be really valuable. Again, I wouldn't change because CLA was so good to us. I wouldn't change my story, but if you can, and like that would be really valuable experience and something to see if you can get around it.
Right on. That's great. And at the risk of sounding self-promoting, I mean that's part of what we're trying to do as a catalyst for church planting in the BC and Yukon district, where we're trying to gather people who are not so much like-minded, but have the same sort of calling and sense of, we're called to church plant, we're called to innovate, we're called to pioneer. We're trying to gather those people together, because I think you're absolutely right. When you can be in those environments with those people, it clarifies the calling. It sometimes will stoke a fire, in you. Now I'm mixing my metaphors, or like you said, water the seed. But anyway, so that's what we're trying to do. Jay, thanks for your time today. If people want to
Pleasure.
connect with you, want to hear more of your story, uh, where do they find you?
Our website is citizenschurch.ca, and my email is just jason@citizenschurch.ca. Or if you search Jason Eliason on social media, I'm on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook. You can
You're
find
on,
me
you're
there.
on Twitter?
I'm like a Twitter consumer. I don't
Oh, okay.
ever tweet, almost ever, but that's where I get a lot of sports and church leader info and
Uh,
news. That's where I find it all there. Can
okay.
be a
So
toxic place sometimes.
bonus question: do you follow Donald Trump?
I do not,
Okay.
um, but he comes up enough in either from people praising him or hating him
Right.
in the people that I follow. So I try to follow a diverse group of people um, along the way. So
Right.
I see the stupid and good things or whatever, you know, I
Okay.
see it.
Yeah. If I keep on asking questions, we're going to get into dangerous political territory here.
I
So.
know I don't want to. Yeah.
Hey Jay, appreciate you and Kel so much, and just the way that you have followed God's call on your life, the way that you lead, and I'll say it publicly, I've said it to you privately, just even the way that you are, shepherding my own daughter and son-in-law, in their ministry journey. Appreciate you so much, and thanks for being part of this interview.
It's a pleasure, Len. Thanks for having me.